Principal Margaret Chen had seen enough fire drills to know the rhythm by heart, the piercing alarm, shuffling feet, teachers herding students like patient shepherds. But tonight, alone in her office with 7 years of emergency records spread before her, that familiar routine felt tainted by something she'd tried to forget. The manila folder labeled October 15th, 2018, trembled in her hands. Outside her window, the autumn wind rattled the bare branches against the glass, creating shadows that danced across the yellowed attendance sheets. All present and accounted for, except one. Tommy Reeves, age 8. Classroom 3B. The boy who vanished during what should have been the safest moment of any school day. Margaret's finger traced the empty box next to Tommy's name, her mind flooding with memories of that terrible afternoon. She could still see his mother's face when she'd arrived to pick him up, the confusion melting into panic as Margaret explained that Tommy hadn't been seen. Since the fire drill began, Sarah Reeves had collapsed right there in the main hallway, her screams echoing off the colourful bulletin boards displaying children's artwork. The investigation had consumed the school for months. Detective Ray Kowalski, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes who specialized in missing children cases, had treated the building like a crime scene. They'd found Tommy's superhero backpack abandoned near the emergency exit, its contents scattered like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. His math homework with a gold star, a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich wrapped in aluminum foil, and a small action figure of Superman that his grandmother had given him for his birthday. Security cameras showed Tommy entering the building that morning, his gap-toothed smile visible as he waved goodbye to his father. But the cameras never captured him leaving. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole, and Margaret had blamed herself every day since. Principal Chen. The janitor's voice made her jump, papers scattering across her desk. Didn't expect to see anyone here this late. She looked up at Frank Morrison, the same man who'd worked these halls when Tommy disappeared. Frank's weathered face carried lines that seemed deeper now, shadows that hadn't been there 7 years ago. His usually steady hands shook slightly as he gripped his mop handle, and Margaret noticed the dark circles under his eyes that suggested sleepless nights. Just reviewing some old files, she said, closing the folder. Her throat felt dry. Frank, do you ever think about that boy who went missing, Tommy Reeves? Frank's mop paused mid-stroke, droplets of dirty water falling to the polished floor. Every day, ma'am, every single day. He set the mop aside and removed his work cap, revealing thinning grey hair. That boy, he haunts this place. Sometimes I swear I can still hear him laughing in the hallways. There was something in his voice, a tremor that made Margaret study his face more carefully. She'd known Frank for 15 years, had watched him transform from a cheerful man who knew every student's name to someone who seemed to carry an invisible burden. The investigation was thorough, she said carefully. They brought in cadaver dogs, searched every inch of the building and grounds. They never found any evidence of foul play. Frank walked to her office window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. Sometimes the evidence is right in front of you, he said quietly, but you're too afraid to see it. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. What do you mean? Frank was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. That day, during the drill, I was in the basement checking the emergency exits. Protocol, you know, making sure all the doors were functioning properly. He turned back to her, his eyes haunted. But I heard something that shouldn't have been there. What kind of something? Crying, a child crying, but muffled, desperate, like it was coming from inside the walls themselves. Frank's hands clenched into fists. I thought I was losing my mind. I ran through those basement corridors, pressing my ear against every wall, every pipe, trying to follow the sound. Margaret's blood ran cold. You never mentioned this before. Who would believe me? I was just the janitor. The police had their experts, their dogs, their fancy equipment. Besides, by the time I got Detective Kowalski down there to check, the sound was gone. Frank's voice cracked. But I never stopped looking, never stopped listening. Over the years, Frank revealed, he'd become obsessed with the building's blueprint. He'd spent his own money on architectural surveys, studying every pipe, every air duct, every forgotten corner. He'd discovered that Lincoln Elementary, built in 1952, had been constructed over an older structure, a small schoolhouse that had burned down in 1923, taking 3 children with it. The basement still contained remnants of the original foundation, including sealed chambers and crawl spaces that weren't on any modern blueprint. The builders just poured concrete over the old ruins, Frank explained. Cheaper than excavating. But that means there are spaces down there that nobody knows about. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through her office windows. Show me. They descended into the basement, past the humming boilers and storage rooms filled with decades of forgotten supplies. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting sickly shadows that seemed to move independently. Frank led her through a maze of corridors she'd never seen before, past unused classrooms that smelled of mildew and neglect. I've been mapping every inch, Frank admitted, producing a hand-drawn schematic from his pocket. Look here, this wall shouldn't exist according to the 1952 blueprints. And this room is too small. Something's behind it. He led her to a section behind the main furnace, where the wall looked different, older brick mixed with newer concrete patches. The mortar was crumbling in places, and Margaret could see where someone had been carefully chipping away at the edges. I've been working at this for years, Frank admitted, producing a small hammer and chisel from his tool belt. Little bits at a time, during my night shifts. Nobody comes down here except me. His voice dropped to a whisper. I had to know. I had to find him. With growing dread, Margaret watched as Frank worked at a section of wall that gave way easier than it should have. Behind it was a small space, barely 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, lined with crumbling brick and filled with decades of dust and debris. And there, curled in the corner like a sleeping child, was a small skeleton wearing the tattered remains of a Superman t-shirt. Margaret stumbled backward, her hand over her mouth, bile rising in her throat. Oh God, Tommy. He must have been exploring during the fire drill, Frank said, his voice thick with emotion and tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Kids that age, they don't always follow instructions. Maybe he found an opening we didn't know about, got curious and crawled in to explore. The space must have collapsed behind him, or maybe he just got lost in the darkness. But Margaret was studying the scene more carefully, her principal's mind cataloguing details that didn't make sense, even through her shock and horror. The opening was too small and too high for an 8-year-old to crawl through accidentally. The skeleton was positioned too deliberately, arms wrapped around something, and there, partially hidden beneath the small bones, was something that made her heart stop. A school identification badge belonging to a teacher who'd left Lincoln Elementary shortly after Tommy's disappearance. Mr. Harrison, David Harrison, the substitute teacher who'd been covering classroom 3B that day when Mrs. Peterson was home with the flu. Frank, she said slowly, her voice shaking, This wasn't an accident. The pieces fell together with horrible clarity. Harrison had been questioned extensively, but released when his alibi held up. He'd been in the classroom during the entire fire drill. According to multiple witnesses, students remembered him taking attendance, remembered him leading them outside to the designated assembly point. But Margaret remembered now that he'd volunteered to help search the building afterward, had been particularly insistent about checking the basement himself. She could picture it now with sickening clarity. Harrison convincing Tommy to hide during the drill, perhaps as a game, or under some pretense. Leading the boy down to the basement, where no one would think to look immediately. He'd hidden Tommy in this forgotten space, alive but trapped, planning to return later with some explanation, maybe claiming he'd found the boy hiding and scared. But the investigation had been too thorough, too persistent. Police had cordoned off the building for days. Harrison had been forced to leave the boy to die rather than risk exposure by returning to free him. Margaret's legs gave out, and she sank to the dusty floor. In her mind she could see Tommy in his final moments, scared, alone, calling for help that never came, the crying Frank had heard, the desperate, muffled sounds of a child slowly realizing that no one was coming. "We need to call Detective Kowalski," she whispered. But before they called anyone, Margaret and Frank sat in the dusty basement, bearing witness to a child's final resting place. Frank had brought a small flashlight, and in its beam they could see that Tommy had been clutching something, a crumpled piece of paper. With trembling hands, Margaret carefully extracted it. It was a drawing, the kind 8-year-olds make with stubby crayons. A stick figure labeled "Me," standing next to larger figures labeled "Mom" and "Dad." Above them, Tommy had drawn a yellow sun with a smiley face, and the words "I love you" in crooked letters. Margaret broke down completely then, sobbing for the little boy who died alone in the darkness, still thinking of his family's love. The investigation that followed was swift and thorough. Detective Kowalski, now graying and near retirement, took the case personally. David Harrison, now living in Oregon under a different name and working as a substitute teacher there too, was arrested within the week. His computer contained thousands of images of children, and when confronted with the physical evidence from Tommy's grave, he eventually confessed. Tommy hadn't been his first victim, Harrison admitted during his interrogation. There had been others over the years, children who'd been reported as runaways or accidents, whose disappearances he'd orchestrated through his position of trust as a substitute teacher. He'd perfected the art of being forgettable, moving from district to district, never staying long enough for patterns to emerge. But Tommy's case had been different. The boy had fought back, had screamed too loudly. Harrison had panicked, shoving him into the hidden space harder than intended. When he'd returned the next day to check on the boy, he'd found Tommy unconscious, barely breathing. Instead of getting help, Harrison had sealed the opening, leaving the child to die. "I never meant for it to go that far," Harrison claimed during his sentencing hearing, but Margaret, sitting in the gallery next to Tommy's parents, felt no sympathy for the man who'd stolen their son's future. At Tommy's funeral, the one his parents had never been able to have, Margaret stood beside Frank as they lowered the small casket into the ground, and Sarah Reeves, prematurely grey but somehow lighter than she'd been in years, approached them afterward. Her husband David stood beside her, his arm protectively around her shoulders. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her voice steady despite her tears. "For never giving up, for bringing our baby home." She turned to Frank specifically. "The detective told us how you never stopped looking, How you sacrificed your own peace to find our son. We can never repay that." Frank shook his head. "Tommy was a good kid. He deserved better than what happened to him. He deserved to come home." David Reeves gripped Frank's hand firmly. "He did come home. Because of you, he came home." Margaret thought about the weight of secrets, how they could crush the innocent as surely as they protected the guilty. Frank had carried his burden alone for 7 years, afraid his word wouldn't be enough, afraid of being dismissed or disbelieved. She thought about all the systems that had failed, the background checks that hadn't caught Harrison's pattern, the building inspections that had missed the hidden spaces, the investigation that had been thorough but not thorough enough. "I'm implementing new policies," she told Frank, as they walked back to their cars through the cemetery where autumn leaves crunched beneath their feet. Anonymous reporting systems for staff and students, regular basement inspections by outside contractors, mandatory psychological evaluations for all substitute teachers. And Frank, she stopped walking and faced him directly. "From now on, when someone hears something that doesn't belong, we listen. We always listen. Your instincts saved other children by stopping Harrison. Never doubt that." Lincoln Elementary reopened 3 weeks later with a memorial garden in Tommy's honor. Margaret made sure Frank was recognized not as just a janitor, but as the man whose persistence and conscience had finally brought a lost child home. The school board gave him a commendation, and the local newspaper ran a story about his dedication that brought donations from across the state to fund the new safety measures. The school felt different now, lighter somehow, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. In classroom 3B, Mrs. Peterson had returned and placed a small Superman figure on the windowsill, along with a framed photo of Tommy, smiling in his school picture. She made sure every new student learned about the boy who'd sat in the third desk of the second row, who'd loved math and recess and believed that heroes always saved the day. Margaret never conducted another fire drill without thinking of Tommy Reeves, but the memory no longer felt like a weight around her neck. Instead, it felt like a promise, a commitment to the safety and dignity of every child who walked through those doors. Some disappearances, she'd learned, were not mysteries to be solved, but truths waiting patiently to be uncovered by those brave enough to keep looking, keep listening, and keep believing that every child deserves to come home. Tommy Reeves had finally come home, and in his memory, Lincoln Elementary would make sure no other child would ever be forgotten or left behind.